This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shendlin.
And I'm Gilad Harper.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. We're counting on you.
Every week we bring you interviews with authors of books, research, and essential topics and other things that we find interesting. This episode is part of a new series sponsored by the Tel Aviv University's Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism. You can find the previous episodes featuring interviews about how communist Romania traded its Jews for cash and goods, as well as anti-Semitism and photography, so-called social Mendelism, and other fascinating topics on our website. Our guest today is Raphael Vago, a retired senior lecturer of history at Tel Aviv University and also a research fellow at the Kantor Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry there. He specializes in Central and Eastern Europe and more specifically the history of the Jewish community and Holocaust memory in Hungary, which is what we'll be talking about today. Raphael Vago, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good evening, thank you very much.
So nothing really reflects the controversial nature of the memory of the Holocaust in Hungary better than the story of the House of Fates, the ambitious Holocaust museum in central Budapest that has been standing empty and unopened for almost a decade.
Don't forget inhabited by rats and bats.
That too. It has cost millions of dollars, much of it government money. Why hasn't it opened yet?
It hasn't been opened yet because of arguments on several sides. One of the sides was that the chief historian who was named to be the projector of the whole project, Maria Schmidt, was not welcomed, to say it very politely, diplomatically, by the Jewish community. Another major factor was that the museum, the planned museum, did not publish, even until now that we are speaking now, its concept, what it will be about and how it will try to treat the subject of the memory of the Jews. Another problematic aspect was and is that finally, some 3 years ago, the responsibility for the museum was taken away from the historian Maria Schmidt, who is very close to Prime Minister Viktor Orban and was one of his advisors, in fact. And it was transferred to Rabbi Shlomo Kovesh, who is the leader of one of the Jewish communities, Emich, in Hungary, which is affiliated with Chabad. And the organized Jewish community, Majihis, led by Andras Heisler, who is the major Jewish organization, umbrella organization in Hungary, are in a constant rift over Jewish identity, Jewish politics, not only politics in Hungary, but among the Jews themselves, with Rabbi Kovesh. So in fact, now the museum is planned to be open in 2024, at least, 24. But the concept of the museum, which as far as we know, it's a document of about 400 pages, hasn't been published yet for public discussion.
But it's not just community politics. Really, there are more substantive issues there about what is the memory and how the memory of the Holocaust and the status of the Jewish community should be represented.
Definitely. The major problem, I would say, that behind it is the whole problem of the museum is how it will try to represent the road to the Holocaust of Hungarian Jewry. And just probably we shall elaborate more in our discussion today, but just to give a very brief outline of these major developments or major differences is that the Hungarian government, led by Mr. Viktor Orban, concentrates more on the date of 19th of March 1944, when Nazi Germany occupied Hungary. And according to the official Hungarian narrative, Hungary lost its independence, or whatever independence it had before, and in fact it lost its sovereignty, and in fact it is not responsible for the fate of the Jews, it is not completely responsible for the fate of the Jews after March 1944. The Jewish community and leading Hungarian historians, I should emphasize here, are trying to explain that in fact we have to see the whole road of Hungarian-Jewish relations for generations, the road between the two world wars, and mainly, chiefly, the role of Admiral Horthy, Nicholas Horthy, who was the leader of Hungary in between the two world wars. And the Hungarian official narrative tries to rehabilitate the memory of Horthy, his role in the Holocaust of the Hungarian Jewry, and in fact, to try to downplay, as I mentioned, events that happened before March 1944.
So was everything great for the Jews before March 19th, 1944?
That's a very intriguing question, because the Hungarian Jewry were very well assimilated into Hungarian society. And in fact, we do not know exactly how many Jews there are today in Hungary. And some people say that if you scrap each Hungarian, you will find some Jewish blood if we are looking at this type of origins.
Even though the official numbers, as far as they're known, are pretty low, right? 47,000 or something, very small?
Yes, but in fact, we are speaking about above 80,000, even more, which is the largest Jewish community west from Russia, and in fact, one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe. Now, between the two world wars, and even before, I must mention that Hungarian Jews received full emancipation in 1867 by the Austrian regime at that time, and there were ups and downs in Hungarian Jewish relations. On the one hand, the rise of anti-Semitism, blood libel even in 1881, 82, and on the other hand, we see between the two world wars, especially after the end of the First World War, a deterioration, or a kind of, some people consider it a divorce between the Hungarian nation and the Jews, anti-Semitic legislation. And Hungary, in fact, was one of the earliest first states in Europe which introduced numerus clausus for Jews in entering higher education. This was in 1920, the first Hungarian law such, which was the first European such law. On the other hand, Hungarian Jews, I would say, continued in spite of the right-wing persecution, or not always persecution, but the right-wing extremism, continued their assimilation into Hungarian society, their relative well-being. And in fact, many historians point out that in spite of all the problems, Hungarian Jewry remained intact between the two world wars.
So, if you take into account the controversial agenda that was promoted, as you said, by Professor Schmidt, who's close to Viktor Orban, about the representation of the Jews, is it really just absolving the Hungarians of any responsibility for the persecution of the Jews? Was that the main issue that was at stake?
I would not put the whole blame or the whole weight of the problem on Maria Schmidt. But the line that she represented and represents is one that downplays the role of the Horthy regime in the anti-Semitic extremism, in fact, a kind of rehabilitation, an emphasis more on what happened after, as I mentioned, after March 1944, and thus a rehabilitation of the whole structure of the Hungarian state and Hungarian society between the two world wars.
But why is it so controversial? Because, as you point out in your studies, even in the 1990s, Prime Minister Horn at the time admitted to the complicity of the Hungarian forces in the persecution of Jews.
And that was after 1944.
Yes,
yeah, and even Viktor Orban himself in 2017.
Yes. Now, first of all, we are now entering the dangerous minefield of Hungarian politics.
Right.
Because Prime Minister Gyula Horn, that you have mentioned, was the leader of the Hungarian Socialist Party. Before that, he was a member of the Communist Party. And he, in 1996, took responsibility for the fate of the Hungarian Jews and blamed the Hungarian state. Now, the narrative of the Orban government is a dual one, a double one. And this makes our problem even more controversial, because on the one hand, the Orban government is a right-wing nationalist government, which tries on the one hand to explain, and this is the Orban narrative, Orban-led narrative, that the Hungarian state gave up its Jewish citizens and betrayed them in the time of crisis, which is completely on the one hand true. On the other hand, it was Orban and other Hungarian leaders and historians and people from the cultural political scene who see Horthy as a major positive figure. So the whole rehabilitation on the one hand of the interwar period on the one hand, and on the other hand, the handing over of the Jews to the Nazis for extermination creates a problem. But I must say here, and again, perhaps it will come up in our further discussion, that there were anti-Jewish steps very strong even before March 1944. Just to give a very almost personal example, I would say that young Jewish men were called up for labor service, which was in fact slave labor by the Hungarian army, and my late father was drafted in 1941-42 to such a battalion of forced labor where the death rate among those Jews who were taken away to the front and behind the front on the homeland was 60 to 70% death rate because of cruel treatment by their Hungarian officers and Hungarian soldiers. Not all of them, but most of them, I would say. Again, I am basing myself also on the memories of my late father, who was in such a battalion much before March 1944.
So you describe in one place that there's a deep fissure between modern Hungarian political society, between the more liberal camps and the more nationalist camps. How does this issue play into those political divides within Hungarian society today?
Hungarian society is a very divided society into the left and to the right. And I a couple of times heard in Budapest, and I saw that I am in Tel Aviv, that you are choosing your friends according to their political camp. And if they belong to the government party, you either like them or you don't like them, and you don't go to a restaurant with such people. And the left, what I would call from the center to the left, from the liberal left to the leftist forces, are very much critical of the present government's policies, not only regard to the fate of the Jews, which is a major case to illustrate their nationalist policy, but also in other aspects of rehabilitating the whole Hungarian political scene between the two world wars, and in fact legitimizing, according to the left, the government is legitimizing the right-wing extremism of between the two world wars. So the Hungarian nationalists are perceiving the Hungarian past as a more positive one, or much more positive one, than the left sees it.
But they are involved in a battle over memory in general about modern Hungarian history. It's not just a question of how to remember the Holocaust. These issues of how to remember the 20th century are front and center to the political debates in Hungary today, just as for example, they are in the U.S., talking about earlier history.
Yes, definitely yes. So the Jewish case, I would say, is the most important case study in this whole political struggle, but this whole political divide. They see Hungarian history as from a more nationalist point of view, in which there is an emphasis on Christian values, national values, Hungary's past, and so on. The left, which is also patriotic, and of course they see themselves as true Hungarians, they see more the positive aspects try to see more the positive aspects of Hungarian history, of those people who are democratic forces, liberal forces. And I must remind ourselves that the Orban government or the Orban regime's ideology is their illiberal society, which is a very interesting from a political science point of view, and in the EU debates, what does it mean in the 21st century to be an illiberal regime? Who are your friends, and so on?
Yeah, and that actually brings me to my next question about where is Hungary positioned on this compared to its neighbors in Central and Eastern Europe? Because we had here on the podcast, this is something that we've discussed in the past, we had Jelena Subotic, who talked about the memory of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia.
Often the manipulation of memory in post-communist environment.
And the American journalist Anne Applebaum, who spoke to us about Poland. And these are issues that always come up when right-wing and ultra-nationalist politics come to the fore in these countries. And Hungary perhaps is perhaps a more advanced example of what you just termed, and this is something that Orban himself termed, an illiberal democracy, something that is really full-fledged in Hungary. Where do you see the difference? Are there any differences between the situation in Hungary and elsewhere in this geopolitical space in which they operate?
Yes, the question is very interesting and intriguing, because I see again a double policy of the Hungarian present regime. On the one hand, and we must always acknowledge it, Hungary is a very safe country for the Jews. Although we haven't spoken yet about anti-Semitism in Hungary, but
next question.
Oh, okay. So if I may already say something.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Okay, then I will try to refrain myself from it. On the one hand, the Hungarian government and Hungarian public personalities and the media, which, by the way, is mostly controlled, is pro-government in the past years, is very much mentioning dates, events linked to the Holocaust and to the past of Hungarian Jews. And the Hungarian government is supporting very much the restoration of Jewish cemeteries, of synagogues, Jewish sites in general, and the leading members of the government and the political party of the Fidesz party are participating in such events. On the other hand, the liberal historians, what I would call the left side, claims that not enough is being done to acknowledge again Hungary's responsibility for the fate of Hungarian Jews. Because if most of the blame is put on the Germans after 1944, which is partially true because they exterminated after Hungary handed over the Jews to the Germans, then the problem is much more crucial. Just to give again a almost personal example, 80% of my family were exterminated in Auschwitz and other camps. After March 1944, my mother and her sister were in Auschwitz. I lost 3 out of 4 my grandparents after 1944 in the process of extermination, but they were collected, I would say, by the Hungarian government, placed into ghettos and handed over to the Nazis to the extermination. And who has done it? It was not something like the Hungarian state, but you must try to assess who are those people. It was the Hungarian officials, it was the Hungarian administration, which remained intact more or less after the German occupation. In other words, Hungary's responsibility and its state authorities for the extermination of the Jews. So from this point of view, I would say very carefully, diplomatically almost, that Hungary hasn't finished yet its full account, the present government's full account to its responsibility about the fate of the Jews in the Second World War. And this is why a large camp of historians are struggling against this phenomenon.
So is what's happening today, in effect, a sense of saying this government is trying to portray we are good for the Jews, we, nurture a Holocaust memory, and we treat the Jews well today, and we rehabilitate cemeteries, and we were always good?
Yes, this is what comes out of this from the narrative. And very interestingly, when you mentioned that Hungary is safe for the Jews, just recently a major public opinion poll was published by a Hungarian NGO, which is close to the government and to Rabbi Köves Chabad. It's called by the Action and Deed Foundation, or something like the English translation would be, which found out among 16 countries surveyed that Hungary has one of the largest numbers of prejudices against Jews, with 35 to 40% of Hungarians having some pattern of prejudice against the Jews. On the other hand, the level of anti-Semitic activities in Hungary is one of the lowest in Europe from the point of view of physical attacks, vandalism, and other kind of anti-Semitic attacks. So,
how do you explain it?
I would explain it that the Hungarian society partly remained with its traditional nationalist, anti-Jewish sentiments up to a certain level, but they do not translate it into physical activities. And the government is very careful in its policies to make Hungary, Budapest, the capital, which is the center of the Jewish life in Hungary, a very vibrant, lively community, and the government is protecting them. And I think I'm following daily, I would say almost daily, the Hungarian media. Almost every day, someone from the Hungarian government and from some of the people from the Jewish communities will mention that Hungary is the safest country in Europe for Jews. On the other hand, we see the results of this major study of 35 to 40% of the people having some kind of prejudices. Among the prejudices, for example, like Jews speak too much about the Holocaust, the Jews brought communism, they are to blame for the communist regime, and other. So we have a very high level of such anti-Semitic prejudices.
Just to say, this kind of contradiction shouldn't be surprising when you yourself said that most of the media is essentially controlled by the government anyway, or reflecting the government line.
It reflects the government line, but is also true in fact. So, for example...
Not everything that they say is a lie.
Exactly.
But maybe not the full picture.
Yeah.
Not the full picture. When I try to follow the Hungarian Jewish life organized by the major community organizations, especially the two major organizations that I have mentioned in the beginning, Majlis and the Emir of the Chabad, which are in conflict with each other over Jewish identity and other problems, Hungarian Jewish life is full with activities. So I think there are more activities than there are actually Jews that can be drafted into these activities. On the other hand, they see almost daily in the some nationalist pronouncements, not extremist right-wing neo-Nazi fascist arguments, but very closely to a nationalist line, which, as I mentioned, try to rehabilitate the Hungarian anti-Semitism and nationalism between the two world wars.
Where does the Jewish community, by and large, stand on the project of illiberal democracy? Because if we take, in the United States, for example, the Jewish community there is really at the forefront of the fight for liberal causes.
Yes, it's a very problematic aspect because the major Hungarian Jewish organization, Majlis, led by András Heisler, has an up and down relationship with the government. They are meeting with government officials, but the Jewish media can be quite critical against the government. On the other hand, they need the government as a partner for discussion, for the safety of the Jewish community, and for the development of Jewish life in Hungary. So I would say, again, quite diplomatically, that the Jewish community tries not to analyze too much the character of the illiberal regime, but they are let's see what they are doing, how they are behaving, how they are treating the Jewish communities, how they are participating in our events, how much funds, how much material support they are giving for our activities, and so on. Now, the Jewish community, and not only in Hungary, this we know from Jewish history as well, tries to accommodate itself very rightly, very correctly, to the prevailing political lines at that time. So we may assume that if in the next year's very crucial elections, the opposition may come back to power, there are now voices that it will be a very crucial election next April in 2022. The Jewish community will have also positive relations with that government as it had when the socialists were in power more than 10 years ago.
But as also learning from Jewish history, the time where the Jewish communities prospered the most were when they were protected by liberal institutions such as the free press and maybe an independent judiciary. All these are being eroded in Hungary over time. Did they ever make any statement on this, even a general one?
I would say if they are making statements, they are more the general ones.
Right.
And not critical of the government. But let me give you, for example, we have an opposite example that may oppose my own view a moment ago. Some few years ago, the Hungarian government attacked the Jewish billionaire George Soros. The Hungarian pronouncement is Soros, so I'm trying to be more on the Hungarian pronouncement. And it was an almost anti-Semitic campaign, at least perceived by the Jewish community and others as anti-Semitic character. And the leader of the Jewish community, the major Jewish community, came out against this campaign. So sometimes they're taking up positions, very clear positions, when they see, look, they are passing a red line which they should not pass.
But this disturbs me because the question of democratic erosion or illiberal democracy, as it pertains to Jews, it should be, to my mind, there should be a contradiction there. And that's that if the government is trying to portray that it nurtures an active Jewish life and protects them, that's based on a certain patronage, right? This community needs our protection. The community says, well, we're getting protected, so we don't really care what the government does with relation to other issues in liberal democracy, including maybe other minority rights. Is that sustainable?
It's a problematic aspect of Jewish politics in the Hungarian politics, because 6 years ago, when there was the major crisis of the migration into Europe, especially into Hungary, Hungary took a very anti-migration policy. And the Jewish community came up in defense of the migrants.
Okay.
And the Hungarian government even now conducts a very tough policy of trying to what they call defend Europe's culture and Europe's borders against illegal migrants. The Jewish community, according to the same policy, defends very much the rights of the Roma, of the Gypsies. And I just mentioned that in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, 2002 or 2003, at Tel Aviv University, we organized a major conference on the fate of the Roma, and there was a large Roma delegation from Hungary. At this conference, we published a book published by the Central European University in Budapest about the fate of the Roma. So the Jewish community...
That is no longer in Budapest, we should mention.
It is in Vienna. It was thrown out by the Hungarian government. I could not find at the moment a more delicate expression, but it was thrown out of Hungary, as you know, which is the truth. So the Jewish community is in the forefront of liberal policies, as you have mentioned on the American example.
Right.
And from this point of view, we can see clashes with the government's line.
But that makes sense, because otherwise it's just dependent on a confluence of political interests as to whether Jews will be protected or not, unless there is an attempt to safeguard the concept, the principle of minority rights.
Exactly.
Yeah. And going back to Soros,
yes.
if I pronounce it correctly.
Soros, yes.
Soros. The fact that he is a Holocaust survivor himself and, of course, a member of the Hungarian Jewish community, to what extent was his case a game changer in this? To what extent did it serve to perhaps taint the whole discussion about Holocaust memory and the place of the Jewish community in Hungarian life?
It was quite a major factor because the government, I would say officially or unofficially, but it allowed voices which reached an anti-Semitic level. Like, for example, mentioning that Soros are people who are trying to infiltrate into Hungary, are people without roots, and this is a very important aspect from speaking about the Jews. Who are the Jews without roots? In other words, the anti-Soros campaign drifted into the whole discussion about the role of anti-Semitism in Hungarian politics, and we must add to this, even if not directly connected, to the ongoing campaign all the time about the short-lived communist republic in Hungary in 1919, where the Jews were overrepresented in the Hungarian government at that time. And the anti-Semites today, they mention, look, Soros had grandfathers from this point of view of communists who tried to take over Hungary in 1919, which in fact is a kind of trivia question, that Hungary was in fact the second Bolshevik communist country in the world after the Russian Revolution.
So actually, this ties into a question that I wanted to ask, which is this just a Hungarian story, or is the question of how the Holocaust memory is preserved or maybe manipulated or used or, becomes a football in political debates, does it have consequences for the world, for other countries dealing with Holocaust memory issues?
Hungary, I would say, is a very interesting case study, like Poland, with some differences, of course, about how we remember the Holocaust, who wants to remember, who wants to know what, who is interested in this. Parallel to this, I must mention that for almost 20 years, Hungarian teachers, educators, are coming to Yad Vashem for seminars about the history of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. I think that I'm participating in this program until the corona for the past 18 or 19 years or so. and they are teaching it in schools. On the other hand, as we try to mention here in our discussion, the memory of the Holocaust is quite problematic. Exactly who wants to remember, what to remember, who was to blame, to what sources, and so on. Because again, I must quote my late mother, that before going to Auschwitz, she hasn't seen German soldiers until they crossed the border where they were handed over to the Nazis in the present territory of Slovakia it was. She has seen only Hungarian gendarmes and Hungarian soldiers and Hungarian officials. So, and the Hungarian state doesn't like to speak about this aspect too much. It is the task of the liberal, what we defined in our discussion as the liberal historians who are trying to remember this aspect.
Do you think there are consequences for this discussion for how other countries remember their own histories of atrocities, if they have them, not necessarily just the Jewish Holocaust?
I would say definitely yes, because in fact, whether we're speaking about Belgium, how the Belgians should remember what they have done, and so on, it is a general human remembers how they behaved, how the local people behaved, how neighbors behaved to each other, which is a very important question in Hungary and not only in Poland, about how they perceive the other, not only the Jews but also the Roma. And we didn't have time for it, but for the Holocaust of the Roma in Hungary was very similar to that of the Jews. Again, so from this point of view, it's not only Hungary. I think Hungary can serve as a case study, a very problematic case study for the memory of the Holocaust in the world.
Yeah, perhaps, looking at it from a broader perspective, you quote in one of your lectures the Hungarian writer Jewry Konrad,
the late Jewish origin,
who in 1985 said that being Central European means to consider variety as a value. And, looking at Hungary and perhaps Poland, that is not so much your field of specialty, but if you look at those laboratories of this kind of politics that we were discussing, can you say what's gone wrong in these 40 years from considering variety as a value to being the forefront of illiberal democracy?
I'm in an awkward position because I have studied and lectured about the fate of Central Europe and what is Central Europe about. I must say that the Hungarian leaders are stressing even today that they are Central Europeans, and the so-called Visegrad group, which is a group of four major Central European countries, Poland, Czechia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, with whom the Israeli government was until now and even now in very good relations.
What do we name names? Netanyahu cultivated the Visegrad group.
Exactly. And they had common conferences with the Visegrad group. What went wrong was that Central Europe was also the cradle of nationalism. And Central Europe was the cradle of excellent humanistic ideals, just as the idea of destruction, because without going into deeper philosophical discussion, Hitler was also a Central European from this point of view.
Right.
That is a fascinating wrap-up. I think we've covered the issue.
Yeah.
Professor Raphael Vago, thank you so much for talking to us about this topic.
Thank you very much for your challenging questions. Thank you.
And thanks to Itai Shela, manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Ross Institute for their generous support for this series. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You can tell the truth, anything. We accept all opinions. You can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with some 750 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Gilad on Twitter. And we'd like to add a special note. The regular listeners among you may have noticed that we have been running some reruns in recent weeks. That's because the podcast will be taking a break for the next 6 months. For the next 6 months, we will have only occasional original episodes like this one, and instead we'll be mining our formidable 8-year archive for the very best of our best of interviews. This hiatus merely reflects some professional and geographic commitments that will keep us from doing the show. But we're looking forward to seeing you on the other side. And thank you as always for listening, and an extra special thanks to those who support us.